All right. So why don't I go ahead and kick us off? Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Maximizing Resourcefulness Extended Supported Employment Solutions. My name is Megan Ketchell, and I'm the project manager for the Disability Employment Technical Assistance Center, or otherwise known as DTAC. We are really excited to have you on today's event, which is a mini Results and Innovation in Systems Excellence, or RISE e-learning community. So this is a single session targeted technical assistance event for participants in the TBI state partnership programs or grants from the Administration for Community Living, as well as for state protection and advocacy systems or PNAs, focusing on TBI or traumatic brain injury. Today is May 13th, and we are partnering on this event with the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, or NASHA, who I'll introduce a bit later, in addition to our two guest presenters in just a few minutes. And Rebecca, you can go to the next slide, and I'll review a couple of logistics for today's event. So, you should be in control of your own audio settings in the Zoom during today's event. We will have plenty of opportunity for questions. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand, and we will allow attendees to come off of mute to ask questions today. You can also ask questions through our open chat by using the drop down and clicking either everyone or hosts and panelists, and you can submit questions there. And then last but not least, we also have the Q&A pod in operation, and my colleague Umaima Mayman will be monitoring that and responding to questions. One of the most common questions we get is, where are the slides? Where can I access the slides? And Umaima has already dropped the link into the chat for those slides, and we'll share that intermittently throughout today's event. In addition, we have American Sign Language interpretation, or ASL, Spanish machine translations, and live English captions during the event today. The link to those is also dropped in the chat in case you need it. And as I mentioned, we will have time for questions throughout today's event, and our presenters will respond to those questions as we have time available and as relevant to today's topic. So you can either chat in, raise your hand, and we'll take you off mute, or you can use the Q&A pod to ask questions. All right, and we can go to the next slide. So here's our agenda for today. We're in the middle of welcome, maximizing your participation, and today's agenda. Then I will turn it over to our other presenters to talk about the benefits of supported employment for people living with brain injury, leveraging work incentives and other strategies for long-term supports, and a spotlight on Minnesota's Extended Employment, or EE program. We'll pause briefly for an open Q&A at the end, but we'll also accept questions throughout the event. So we might skip over that ending Q&A session if we answer everything earlier in the call. We'll also leave you with some linked resources and then close out from there and give you back the rest of your day. So we can move to the next slide. All right, and I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our amazing speakers for today. So first off, we have Jill Farrington, who is the Director of Community Integration at the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, or NASHA. We are so happy to be working with Jill again, and we've worked with NASHA on DTAC for several years now and have done a lot of great resources and events, and excited to welcome Jill back. In addition, we have Kelly Land, who is a former senior technical assistant and trainer from the Virginia Commonwealth University. And Kelly also is the principal of her consulting agency, which is 3 Land Consulting. And we're so happy to welcome Kelly to today's event as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Megan Hansen, Megan with an H. I'm Megan with no H. And Megan is an extended employment program specialist at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, in the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation Services in the state of Minnesota. So we have a great lineup of presenters today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Jill Farrington to kick us off with our content for today's event.
Thanks so much, Megan. It is great to be here. It's great to see familiar names in the participant list, and really happy that you set aside some time in your day to attend our session. A tiny little bit of background. Last year, through the support of the Disability Employment Technical Assistance Center, my colleague Maria Crowley and I were able to do some technical assistance in Nebraska. So shout out to Carrie Bennett, who's on the line. And we focused in on what this topic is today. And we thought after finishing the TA that it might be a nice way to package up some of what we learned and some of what we shared by doing this session. So we're very thankful for the DTAC in supporting what our event is today. So when we sat down and really thought about what do we hope attendees take away, it's the following. Looking at how certain brain injury factors do create intensive employment support needs for some of the people that we all work with. And then we want to give an understanding of the benefits of supported employment for people with brain injury, including customized employment. And then finally, we want to consider creative options for long-term supports, because sometimes individuals don't have a lot of obvious avenues, for example, paid Medicaid waiver services. So we are excited about talking about ways that we fill in those gaps in creative methods. So further, I just wanted to mention, if you are here as a TBI grantee, we think that this is important information that you may find you want to incorporate into your employment planning and supports as part of your state plan, for example, if that's an area that you identify. There may be information today that's informative for your needs assessments, and in general, just your systems work in general. And then protection and advocacy attendees, we are excited that you're here. We know that many of you have a really solid understanding of a lot of this material, and we just want to heighten the comprehensive planning and what that should look like for people with significant disabilities due to brain injury. And if you're an employment service provider, we know that what we hope for is that you can apply maybe a new option that you hadn't thought about before to promote employment for persons with significant brain injury and barriers. So I'll go on to the next slide. And it'll be important, I think, just to spend a few moments getting on the same page about the overarching way that we're talking about brain injury today. So if we go on to the next slide, this is a visual that we oftentimes share, and that is that we look at brain injury as having an umbrella term, if you will, of acquired brain injury. And that under that term, we see that people sustain brain injuries in different ways. They may be by an external force, which is a traumatic brain injury, and they may be internal events, and those are non-traumatic brain injuries. So we think of stroke, or we think of anoxia, other conditions that lead to oftentimes the very same levels of brain injury symptoms for individuals. So we are not focusing in squarely on traumatic brain injury. We know that this event is directed at TBI grantees, but we've long known that it's okay to approach this topic in a more general way. So this presentation is applicable across brain injury. So if we go on to the next slide, we want to just talk a bit about how acquired brain injury can show up. The outer boxes in blue outline are some of the symptomology that may apply to individuals. And it's important, I think, that we recognize how valuable it is to know the specific ways that individuals are struggling with their individual, very personal brain injury, because it never looks all the same. And so a person may have executive functioning issues, such as organizational skills, as mentioned in the top left. On the bottom left, someone else may have an executive functioning issue that really complicates memory, lack of follow through, and those types of strategies that are expected along the pathway to employment. So again, on the top left, a person with organizational skills. If we then focus in on the blue circle and those parts of the circle, an individual may agree to drop off paperwork and just not do it. Not because they don't want to follow through, but they just may not have the organizational skills to assure that it happens. And then a person with memory issue, and this happened to me as a VR counselor, may just completely miss a job interview that we've practiced for, that we've bought clothing for. And that can happen without those strategies for knowing how to maintain a schedule. A person with brain injury may also have possible physical or sensory issues. An example might be light or noise sensitivity. So they may seem edgy or fidgety during an intake, and we might misconstrue that if we don't know that it's tied to brain injury. And then on the bottom right, a person with their particular brain injury may also struggle with emotional regulation or judgment issues, lack of ability to filter. And that might result in a new supervisor complaining about, for example, an inappropriate remark that a person makes. So we can see how the areas of symptomology related to brain injury just keep on rising up in the vocational rehabilitation or the employment search process to sometimes really complicate that pathway. So we'll go on to the next slide. And just emphasize that there is absolutely a continuum when it comes to what people with brain injury need when it comes to vocation. We sometimes in the past have thought about brain injury as mild, moderate, and severe. And we might therefore think that a person has mild, moderate, or severe employment needs. And really, what we know is that it's all about a person's current functioning. So we're moving away, even though it's sometimes still talked about in medical terminology, mild, moderate, and severe, we mostly focus on a person's current functioning. So if we think about the arrow that points to the left, a person who has not as substantial impediments or functional limitations may need a lighter touch with employment supports. They might need retraining. They might need assistive technology. They might simply need really strong vocational guidance and counseling that VR offers up as its really, in my mind, premier service. But we also know that there are people that have more significant day-to-day challenges, and that might result in them being on the continuum that points to the right. And that is an individual who may need discovery types of services, ways to really look at what the person has as a wish and a value related to work going forward after a very life-changing brain injury. They may need job placement supports, very hands-on supports. They may need supportive coaching once they get a job. And in some of the work that's done through employment programs, we term that systematic instruction. And then many times extended supports, those supports that stay in place to be there for the person as they go forward in their job, are really needed by people with those more significant disabilities. So if we go to the next slide, we would like to share that we know that employment strategies can truly help everyone, even if they have those more significant disabilities on the continuum that we just looked at. And that oftentimes is most impactful when we are applying what's termed supported employment. Again, I see lots of VR folks in the group today, and so you all know this topic very well. And others of you that don't work in VR this may be more newer terminology, or at least some of the aspects of supported employment. And so that's why we're going to dive in today to this topic. We know that supported employment can make a difference for people that we would otherwise think may not be able to work, but with the right kinds of supports, they may be able to. Customized employment is one of the strategies that is more innovative, I believe, personally, and newer, more current approach that is taking a look at position that is crafted for a person, looking at what an employer's needs are, and then building a job around that person's talents. Different than supported employment more traditionally, where we might take a job for a person and then provide all the supports to help them learn it fully. Or we might carve out a part of an existing job in a supported employment model. You may or may not be aware that self-employment can also fit under this umbrella of supported employment. So that person who has the talent and that interest in being an entrepreneur could receive self-employment supports from a state agency and supported employment services as an overlay. So you don't have to be as independent as you might think to benefit from self-employment supports. So hopefully that is a takeaway today. So the objective of supported employment, just to be clear, is really about helping people work in regular opportunities that any of us may seek in our towns or cities, or sometimes we say it's jobs in the community. It's when people work alongside others that don't have a disability and they make minimum wage minimally, or more likely they make wages that are comparable to their similarly qualified peers. And they also have the opportunity, just like their coworkers, to have advancement opportunities. So when we talk about supported employment, the takeaway here is just that we're never talking about sheltered employment settings. I think that's all I wanted to say on this slide, so we can go on to the next one. And this is a slide to go back to a term that was mentioned previously. And this is a topic that I see that comes up oftentimes with employment types of offerings, or anytime that we're focused in on supported employment. And that is really highlighting and putting a spotlight on the discovery process. Discovery process is one of the key components of that customized employment that you heard me mention, where we essentially craft a job for a person. And the way that looks in more specifics is that we're viewing the individual descriptively rather than evaluatively. So we're really getting to know, it's a very person-centered process where we're not as much about assessing, but observing and getting to know an individual and what their job values are and their passions. We're working through a discovery process to uncover talents, capabilities, contributions, and conditions for success. Sometimes in a discovery process, we're very much learning about a person's talents and capabilities from the person themselves. Other times we're learning that from the people that surround them and know them well. Discovery provides an opportunity for employment for all individuals, regardless of severity of disability. And it's oftentimes called a qualitative, no-fail, person-centered process. So when you hear a discovery as it relates to employment services, you hopefully have some background to know what that really means and what the person should experience. So if we go on to the next slide, I'd like to share how supported employment becomes an option for a person in vocational rehabilitation, typically. So a lot of what we're talking about today is centered around that experience of utilizing that public vocational rehab program. So a person is deemed to be a supported employment candidate, usually very early on in the vocational rehabilitation process. Not always, because that can be a change in pathway later, but oftentimes it's identified as part of the assessment and evaluation process. So that's the first box on the left. The one next to that indicates that the counselor is knowing, by getting to understand the person and looking at their background and looking at the day-to-day areas where they may struggle, that this person may need intensive supported employment services and extended services over time. Oftentimes the supported employment pathway is deemed appropriate when an individual has had real interrupted job placement background or intermittent due to the significance of their disability. So possibly a lot of attempts in the past that just didn't work. And also in the fourth box, it may be the case that employment has historically not occurred for the person at all. They may be a younger individual that's never yet tried employment, or after brain injury, they may have not ever attempted to go back to work after sustaining, again, a life-changing brain injury. So the technical term that I wanted to throw out that you might hear as you're working with individuals and you're getting to know their voc rehab counselors, if that's part of your work, is that you may hear the person has to fall in a certain category of severity, and that's called the most significant category. And VR programs around the country classify individuals based on their daily functional losses that they have. And supported employment is meant for those individuals that have the most functional losses. And if a person is told that they can't be in supported employment because they didn't fall into that most severe category, there's always the option to take a second look at it. Was all the information looked at? Is there a need to revisit? So if we go on to the next slide, quickly, I just wanted to highlight that most often when we're talking about supported employment, you may hear and know that waivers, home and community-based services waivers, play a significant role. They play a significant role for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but they can also play a really important role for people that happen to be in a brain injury waiver program. This map shows the areas where there are specific brain injury waivers. There are other states that have very tailored brain injury services within a more global or super waiver. Those aren't included on this map. These are states with brain injury waivers. So the ones in the red are those states that have employment supports, supported employment, customized employment within their waivers potentially. And those states that are in the yellow have a brain injury waiver, but they do lack employment supports as within their service array. So on the next slide, what we wanted to share are some examples when states are plugging in the kinds of services that help to support a person's employment pathway. Some of them are very traditional, what we would think about, and those are in the left column. The states that were in red have typically supported employment, which covers placement, job coaching, discovery that we talked about earlier, person-centered employment planning, technical support to employers, resume development. Many of those kinds of services can be available through a waiver that has added supported employment to their service array. But the next bullet is a real important one, and that's intensive ongoing support. What it means for a vocational rehabilitation program and an HCBS waiver working to support a person is that typically voc rehab is going to do a lot of the front end heavy lift, help the person get the job, help them get trained on the job, and then there's going to be a handoff, and that handoff goes back to the waiver Medicaid program to provide the ongoing supports that a person may likely need over the course of their job. On the right side are some additional kinds of services that we see in states. I won't read off all of them, but you can see that more of those promising practices have been called out in many waivers. So there's a number of states, for example, that have customized employment specifically named as in their service array. Some of the states specifically call out self-employment, coworker supports, financial literacy and asset development, development of experiential learning opportunities or work experiences, and then post-placement intermittent support. So those are some examples of what we see when we look around the country at home and community-based services brain injury waivers. And what we hope is that over time, most or all of the brain injury waivers have heightened the importance of employment and have added that to their service array. So going on to the next slide, I am going to get ready to transition us into the next topic, which is we've heard all about supported employment now and how vocational rehabilitation can work side by side with the Medicaid service system of home and community-based waivers to make sure that a person has the needed paid long-term supports. But that's not always the case for individuals. You saw all the states that don't have employment in their service array for brain injury waivers, and then many states don't have brain injury waivers at all. That doesn't mean that some people with brain injury aren't on a waiver that provides long-term supports. Depending on the age of their injury, they may be on an intellectual and developmental disability waiver or another waiver that provides employment supports. But for some people that we all would like to see succeed in employment, they may not have an option for an obvious long-term support, meaning they don't have paid Medicaid supports through a waiver. So what we want to talk about next with Kelly is what do we do then? And before we shift over to her, I do want to check in with Kelly to find out, have there been any questions, or do any of you have any questions that you would like to raise before we change topics?
Hi, Jill. It's Kelly. We do not have any questions right now, but we can give it just a few seconds to see if anybody has any questions that they put in.
All right. Well, it sounds good because there'll be plenty of time for more questions later. So Kelly, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. Thanks so much. All right. Thank you, Jill. As Jill stated, I'm going to really focus on work incentives and other ways that we can support individuals with traumatic brain injuries if they don't have those waivers, as she just showed on that map. And just for some of you that I know kind of showed up late, I'm a former senior TA and technical assistant for the National Training and Data Center and a certified benefits counselor, been in the field a little over 20 years. So happy to help answer any questions or just be creative on finding services for individuals. We can go to the next slide. Great, thank you so much. So I want to first start with defining what work incentives are. So most of you might know what they are, but just in case, work incentives are special rules from the Social Security Administration that will make it easier for people with disabilities to try working without immediately losing their benefits. That's a big myth out there that as soon as you go to work, you would lose your benefits. But there are these great incentives that are available to individuals. And these incentives are designed to help individuals transition into employment while still maintaining access to income, to their supports, and to their health care while they're building that financial stability. A few examples that we're going to talk about today are IRWEs, which are impairment work-related expenses, and PASS, which is a plan to achieve self-support. Sorry, next slide. So one of the tools that I just mentioned was the impairment related work expenses, or we call them IRWEs, because we have lots of acronyms in our fields. And by using the IRWE work incentive, Social Security will deduct the cost of certain impairment related items and services a person needs to work from their gross earnings when they're figuring out the countable earnings. So we're going to talk about a real life example of what we could use an IRWE for long-term supports, but I'm going to go through exactly what an IRWE is and how it is approved through Social Security first. So when Social Security is using the countable earnings, they're figuring out how much to reduce somebody's SSI, or their supplemental security income payment. Many different expenses that can qualify for an IRWE. That could be attendant care services, medical devices, maybe a service animal and the care, and co-pays for prescriptions. Those are just some of the immediate ones that we know of that are used quite often. Now, if we go to the next slides, you can also use an IRWE for very specific items. And again, we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But there are some specific requirements that a person needs to meet before they can get an IRWE approved. The IRWI needs to be related to disability or to the impairment that the individual has. So it can't be that everybody within the organization or within the business needs uniforms. So it has to be very specific to the person and their disability. It also needs to be that the person is receiving treatment from a healthcare provider. The item also needs to be necessary for work. So they may need transportation, but if they don't need transportation specifically for work, then that wouldn't be considered an IRWI. The IRWI also has to be paid for out of the beneficiary's pocket and not reimbursed by insurance or any other entity. And it also needs to be paid for generally within the month that the person is working or receiving earnings. Now, sometimes there's going to be bigger items the beneficiary is paying for, and that can be prorated over a 12-month period. Next slide, please. So this is going to give us an example, because you might say, hey, I know what an IRWI is, but how is this going to help us with long-term supports for the individuals that we serve? So I want to give you guys an example. So let's look at an example where an individual could use the IRWI to help pay for job coaching on the job. Okay, so obviously this is going to be for an individual that does not have those free supports. As a person who's working with individuals, you always want to see if they have a waiver, if they have VR, if they have other supports that are going to help them on the job. But we're going to work with Leonard, and Leonard has a brain injury following a stroke. He works with the leopards at the zoo, and he makes $10 an hour. He works 25 hours a week, and he needs help paying for a job coach to help him organize his daily tasks and to create a routine at work. As Jill talked about earlier, sometimes that can be something that someone needs help with when they go to work. So Leonard is planning to have a job coach for 10 hours a week. Leonard is not on a waiver, and he will pay for the job coaching out of his own pocket. The job coach will be $15 an hour. So when we do this calculation, we're going to look at the $15 an hour times 10 hours, because it's the job coach's rate of pay, plus the $10 an hour, or I'm sorry, plus the 10 hours a week. That's going to equal $150. And then we always multiply that times 4.33 when we're doing estimates. Now, once you are submitting this to Social Security, you're not going to use estimates as much. You're going to provide them with receipts that I paid for this job coaching out of pocket. This is exactly how much I paid. But just for you to understand the concept, we typically do an estimate, and we use 4.33 to multiply that by, because some months have 4 weeks, some months have 5 weeks. So again, our calculation is the job coach's hourly wage, which is $15 an hour, times 10 hours a week. That equals $150. We're going to multiply that times 4.33, which gives us $649.50. So this amount would be reduced from the beneficiary's countable income, which allows them to earn more money and continue to receive Social Security benefits. So now they're paying for their job coaching, but they're also still getting more money out of their Social Security, their SSI check, and they're able to work at their job with the supports that they need. I typically talk a little fast through these calculations, so I just want to pause and make sure there's no questions about this example specifically.
None have come up in the chat.
Great. All right, well, we'll move on to the next slide. So the next work incentive that could be used to help somebody come up with long-term supports for them when no other supports are available is called a plan to achieve self-support, or a PASS. And this can help pay for vocational supports. It also allows people with disabilities or blindness to set aside resources or various kinds of income for specified periods. They can use this money towards an occupational work goal, to start a business, or for supports that they need on the job. Some examples of what a beneficiary can use a PASS for are obtaining education towards their vocational goal, receiving vocational training supports, starting a business, or getting support services that may help them go to work or keep their job. Now, you will see here that I have a note that says this must be temporary. You can't use a pass for ongoing long-term supports. It would have to be for something that would be temporary, that would help that person be more successful on the job. I'm going to show you an example of that here in just a few slides. We can go to the next slide. So let's first review the past requirements. So the beneficiary must have a feasible work goal. They need to have a specific savings and spending plan. They have to have a clearly identified account for the funds to set aside in the past plan, and follow the pass as agreed with Social Security. Typically with a pass, they'll have a Social Security representative. They call it the pass cadre that will help walk them through the pass, the approval, and then help monitor the pass plan. Now, again, if a beneficiary is going to use a pass to help with on-the-job coaching or job supports, the goal does need to have it does need to be temporary. It needs to be intended to enhance their long-term success at work, and there does need to be an end goal to that support. Next slide. So let's look at an example. Here we have Jordan. He's a 29-year-old who sustained a traumatic brain injury in a car accident, and he had that 2 years ago. He currently receives SSI benefits and is motivated to return to work. Before his injury, Jordan worked in retail. Now he has an opportunity to return to a part-time position at a local hardware store, working with a long-term goal of becoming a full-time inventory coordinator. While Jordan's physical recovery is nearly complete, he continues to face challenges with short-term memory, task sequencing, and maintaining focus. To succeed in the workplace, Jordan needs temporary, targeted support to help him build strategies for staying organized and focused. So let's see how we could put a pass into place. Next slide. So the solution may be a pass, working with a benefits planner. Jordan develops a pass to fund short-term job coaching services, and his plan includes the following. He wants to use some vocational goal to become a full-time inventory coordinator within a 12-month period. The supports he needs is weekly job coaching. That would be 3 hours a week for 6 months. And this will assist him in setting up a phone reminder or phone reminders, visual schedules, and other workplace accommodations. He also needs some expenses covered, and that would include the job coach's salary, his mileage reimbursement, and a smartwatch with full features that would include alerts and reinforcing his independence on the job. Now, by setting aside a portion of his income or back pay into the pass, Jordan will reduce his countable income, allowing him to continue to receive his full SSI check or his cash benefit, while the pass funds the services needed to reach his employment goal. So again, you can see that we can put that pass into place. He will continue to stay financially stable as he's getting the supports and the services he needs to be successful on the job. Once Jordan is successful on the job, the pass plan will be complete, and then he can just continue to work the job and report his earnings to SSI as needed. It is important to note that these work incentives can also be used, both of them that I've talked about, the IRWI and the PASS, they can be used on Title II as well, or we also call that SSDI. However, there are a few more requirements and a few more restrictions when we use them on those programs. So you'll want to discuss those specific work incentives for a Title II beneficiary with the benefits counselors that you have available to you. Now, before I move on to our next segment, are there any questions about the PASS plan or the IRWI that we've talked about? Okay, not seeing any in the chat. We'll just go ahead and move on. So the two things that I just discussed do take money, right? The person has to pay for the IRWI out of pocket, or they need to have a past plan set and an account set up where they're going to pay for those services. So I want to talk to you briefly about an idea of how to do the financial supports for an individual. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about an ABLE account, or an Achieving a Better Life Experience. For those of you that are not familiar with an ABLE account, let me just briefly describe this program. So in 2014, Congress passed the ABLE Act. This allowed states to set up a new tax advantage savings program for certain individuals with disabilities. Congress created the ABLE accounts to help people with disabilities. These are referred to as designated beneficiaries, and their families to save and pay for qualified disability expenses. And that they would be able to do that without losing eligibility for their means tested programs like SSI or their Medicaid. Now, the designated beneficiaries or others can contribute up to $19,000 per year, and that's in 2025. That amount does change each year. And this amount does include gifts or contributions that they get from friends or family, a special needs or pooled trust, and their 529 college savings account rollovers. Next slide. Now, there are some eligibility criteria a person must meet to qualify. So for the ABLE account limits, or the ABLE Act limits, eligible individuals with disabilities need to have an age of onset of their disability before turning the age of 26. If an individual meets this age requirement and receives benefits under SSI or Title II, the Social Security Disability Insurance, Childhood Disability Benefit, or a disabled widower's benefit, they're automatically eligible to set up their ABLE account. If an individual is not a recipient of SSI or Title II, it does not, but they still meet the age requirement, the disability age requirement, they can still set up the eligible account. They just need to meet Social Security's definition and criteria regarding their functional limitations. Now, the good news to this is, because I think a lot of you on here, one of the fights that we've had for many years is that a person could get a traumatic brain injury or also become disabled after the age of 26. And it was really unfair that they were not eligible to set up an ABLE account and save money for long-term supports or other qualified disability expenses, just because they weren't a certain age when they became disabled. So as of January 1st of 2026, the age did get increased to 46. So we still have an age requirement. We didn't win the total fight, but the age requirement did increase to 46. So that'll start as of January of 2026. Next slide. Now, you do have to use the funds on that qualified disability expenses that I keep mentioning. And there's several examples on the slide. That's including education, food, housing, transportation, employment training and supports, assistive technology, healthcare expenses, financial management and administrative services, and other expenses which will help improve health, independency, and quality of life. So, really, they can be used for a lot of things as long as you can qualify them back to the person's improving their health, their independence, or their quality of life. The biggest thing that I want to point out here is that these funds could be used to help pay for job coaching or long-term supports. So if somebody had an ABLE account, you could easily use those expenses to help pay for the job coaching or long-term supports. Next slide, please. And just a quick note, because I know we're probably running just a little bit over time, or at least close to time, and I want to leave time for questions, is that you can have up to $100,000 in an ABLE account before your SSI is going to be affected, as well as your Medicaid is not affected based on the amount of money that you have in an ABLE account. There are a little nuanced differences as well. Some people say, well, why can't I have a pass compared to an ABLE account? It is important for you to know that passes and ABLE accounts are very different. If you put wages into an ABLE account, then that is going to still be considered wages for Social Security. You can put it in there, you can save it. It's just still wages that need to be reported to Social Security. If you have them in a pass account, remember, as I talked about earlier, that will be reduced from your countable income and you would still receive your full SSI check. So just a little bit of differences that we would need to talk about if you have questions around that. All right, and quickly just going into our next segment, which is employment supports. I think it is important for people to know that there are other employment supports out there besides vocational rehabilitation and Medicaid waiver. Next slide. And so this would be our Ticket to Work program. And so Ticket to Work offers a free support to, or employment supports to Social Security disability beneficiaries. It is a self-sufficiency program, meaning that a person needs to be working towards self-sufficiency and having a high enough income to reduce or eliminate their need for Social Security disability benefits. Also, there is an age requirement between 18 to 64 to use this program. Next slide. There are specific goals for this program. As I've already talked about, it is a self-sufficiency program. However, that can be done over a long-term plan. It doesn't need to happen right away. And I think a lot of times people forget that they think people just need to work right off their benefits. That can be over a long-term plan that's designed with your employment network. Next slide. And just a few highlighted benefits of the program is one, it does give those free employment supports on the job for an individual. It also allows a person to, if they have to reduce their hours or they have to quit work, they have access to an expedient reinstatement, which allows them to get back on benefits quicker than just reapplying for a benefit. They would need to be terminated from benefits, but it is a benefit of the Ticket to Work program. As well as, this is probably the highlight of the program, a beneficiary is also protected from receiving a medical continuing disability review or a CDR while making expected progress as they're working with their employment network towards their educational or their vocational goal. This is huge for somebody with a traumatic brain injury because it may have taken them a long time to get on Social Security benefits. They would have this protection to not have that medical continuing disability review as they're looking for a job, as well as have those free supports on the job to help them become successful. Next slide. And how to use the Ticket to Work program. There's just one more slide and we'll do some quick answers to some questions that you guys have, I see in the chat. But a beneficiary can choose an employment network or a state vocational agency if they're found, a vocational rehabilitation agency if they're found able. And you can find where to find the people that are in their area and what services will support the individuals you serve by going to that choosework.ssa.gov website. And you go to find help and you can just put in a zip code and what services the individual you're serving needs. And it will give you a list of areas or of individuals that are doing employment networks to help with employment supports. And then also will help you find benefits counselors in your area as well. Okay, before we move in, I know that I sped through that. I just want to pause real quick to see if there were any questions in the chat box, Jill, that I can help answer.
Yeah, for certain. We had a question from Pamela about if you know how it was decided to use the age of 46 versus a different older age.
I do not. I wish I had that answer for you. I'm sure that it was in the committee meetings. Again, I think we were all wishing that there was no age limit, but sometimes we have to sacrifice and take what we're able to get at that time.
Thank you. And Heather made a really great point that this is all fairly complicated information, but it's wonderful to know that every state has the kinds of benefits planners that that Kelly's been describing. And so the choosework.ssa.gov site helps you find your benefits planner for anyone that you're serving that is trying to get that sort of support. We call them the number crunchers, and they pass lots of tests to do this work.
Yes.
And with that, I don't think there were any other questions, but certainly
Great.
if anybody has one that they want to come off mute for and ask, now would be a fine time to do that as well.
Yeah, and I just want to also say you will get copies of these slides, so please feel free to go through them in more detail. And I believe our contact information is on here as well. You're more than welcome to follow up with me on any of my slides. Thank you so much, and I'm now going to turn it over to Megan Hansen.
You, Kelly. Good afternoon. I am Megan Hansen, and I am the grant specialist in Minnesota for the Extended Employment Program. And just here to share a little bit about this program with you all today. It is fairly unique to the state of Minnesota. We commonly refer to it as EE. So just to make sure I say that so you know what I'm referring to. And it's a program that offers, we can move on to the next slide. It's a program that offers long-term supports to individuals with significant disabilities in retaining their employment and advancing in their careers. EE is legislated in state statute here in Minnesota with what we call the EE rule. So the EE program sits within the Vocational Rehabilitation Services Agency, kind of the overarching agency. And within that, we have three what we call pillars. And so the VR program is one pillar. It has its own state statute with a rule and funding. And then our IL centers also have their own statute with funding. And then extended employment is the third one. So it is actually separate from our VR program. But of course, you have to have an agency to administer the grants. And because we serve a very similar population, it's within the VR program. But the advantages of it being in a separate part of the state statute and funding allows some autonomy for the two programs to interact with each other. As it shows on here, because it has its own pot of funding, it is appropriated $18,325,000 per year currently. We're in the middle of a legislative session, so I'll find out if I get the same amount next year. But it does not receive any federal funding. It's entirely state funded. All right, next slide, please. Jill gave us some really good details on supported employment. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but I think it's really important to understand the history of some of that. Because going all the way back into the 50s, the history of how it came about really starts with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was created by President Roosevelt and at the time the U.S. Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. And Secretary Perkins suggested the creation of sub-minimum wage, which is a lower wage adjusted to one's productivity that could be used for substandard workers. So for reasons like injury, illness, disability, age, and if they could pay them based on their productivity rather than a minimum standard. At that time, it was envisioned as a way to create employment and training opportunities for people with disabilities, which was a crucial time for many who were institutionalized and excluded from education systems. And so this concept was written as Section 14C of the law. And then in the 60s and 70s, legislation was enacted to create the Federal Community Mental Health Act of 1963, the Rehab Act of 73, the IDEA Act in 1975, and then of course the first Centers for Independent Living were created. And as we move into the 90s and beyond, that's when the Americans with Disabilities Act was created. And all of this kind of comes together. And in terms of the Extended Employment Program is what really created the EE program for Minnesota, what we have today. Because then meanwhile, when all of this is going on in the 80s in Minnesota, the legislative auditor was kind of pushing back on the sheltered workshops that we had, and we're challenging that. So the first EE rule was created for our program year of 1985. So over the years of 84 and 85. It funded nonprofits across the state. We can actually move to the next slide, please. It funded nonprofits across the state, and they set up sheltered employment, including what we termed sheltered workshops. And in 1987, the program year, the legislature added community employment to our EE rule here in our state, which required outcome-based funding for workshops and moved to supporting individuals with significant disabilities who were already employed. And so the funding really started to move from those sheltered workshops and community or center-based employment to supporting community employment, both in work groups and more individually. So if we could move to the next slide. As I mentioned, EE does have its own appropriation, and those funds come directly from Minnesota's general fund and our workforce development fund. And again, it is separate from the VR program. And I tend to repeat that in my presentations because it is something people get a little confused about and causes a little bit of confusion around whether people are double dipping if they're utilizing VR programs or some of the other programs that even Kelly talked about versus the extended employment program. And it's a very intentional split between them so that EE, as I mentioned earlier, is intended to support people as to retain their employment over time and to help them advance in their careers. So while they may be utilizing waiver services to get into employment or utilizing VR programs for placement, even some kind of like evaluations and other things, EE can support them in a job that they have at the time. While they may be utilizing services for other goals that they're setting and trying to achieve. From a grant perspective, these are pay-for-performance contracts, and it was set up in a way to allow continued funding for nonprofits. The grants vary. We have 26 nonprofits currently in our state right now that receive grants, and those grants vary between the $67,000 for our smallest program to as large as $2.5 million, and then kind of varied amounts in between. And each program is a little different. Because they have a grant contract, they're allowed some autonomy depending on where they're located in our state. State of Minnesota has a larger metropolitan area, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Twin Cities. But then we also have a lot of really rural communities around the rest of our state, what we call outstate Minnesota. And so those communities are very different. And there's a lot of programs within the Twin Cities, and then there's just as many programs kind of scattered around the state. And so the grants really are very dependent upon where they're located and how many people they have in their area to serve. So if we could move forward. Within those grants, they are able to take the funding they receive and split it amongst 3 sub-programs. So as I said, when EE was first beginning, we had our center-based employment, and over time they moved to adding the community employment component and then supported employment. Currently, those 3 sub-programs include these 3. Supported employment really is the competitive integrated employment. Individuals have their provider of record is the employer, and their, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. The employer of record is different than the provider of record. So they are out in the community working a job and they're receiving supports from an EE provider. Community employment might be that they do have an employer of record that is different than their provider, but their provider is likely on site at the employer, or they are the employer, but it's out in the community. A Goodwill is a good example. We have a couple of Goodwills here in Minnesota that have retail stores, and they have individuals working more in their sheltered workshop, but also out in their retail locations. So they have a mix of center-based employment and community employment. But here in Minnesota, we're actually moving away from supporting center-based employment. So this is the last year that our extended employment grants will fund a center-based program. Many of our providers have moved away from having any type of work floor or sheltered workshop. When they found out in 2019, we rewrote our rule to phase out our center-based employment. And they wrote in there that we would phase out through the program year 26, that we wouldn't be able to fund those programs anymore. So this coming program year is going to be the last year that they're able to have that type of service. A lot of them have phased those programs out because they knew it was coming. So going forward, we will only have either work crews or the supported employment. In 2024, we served 2,653 people. And amongst those, the individuals worked 2.3 million hours and earned $39 million, almost $40 million amongst themselves, which is a return on investment of $2 for every dollar spent on this program. Something I want to point out is the year before, we actually served 2,700 people, a little over 2,700, and those 100 more individuals actually earned $1 million less than the group forward. So I think the efforts around encouraging individuals to advance in their careers and work in competitive or more integrated settings has really demonstrated over the years that their earnings are going up. And the providers are encouraged to support that programming because they are actually paid based on every hour worked by the participant. So those contracts, the 67,000 through 2.5 million, are paid based on that 2.32 million hours worked. And it's broken out into different rates, but it's intended that way to really encourage the most independent work possible to the person's abilities and preferences. Next slide. So who's eligible for the program? It is, as Jill mentioned earlier, she talked a lot about the significant disability, and that is what EE is set up around. So EE is intended to support the most significantly disabled individuals. So they must have a diagnosed disability, and then 3 or more functional limitations. And oftentimes these individuals, and I'll speak a little bit more about this in a future slide, but a lot of times these individuals are referred through our VR programs, so they are able to identify that in VR and then work with the provider on that. But providers through our EE rule are also given the ability to identify the functional limitations. So individuals can refer themselves to these programs. It's not required for them to be part of VR. So it's really important for our providers to understand what the functional limitations that they need to address are. Next slide, please. Additional eligibility. The one thing that excludes individuals from being eligible is being on a waiver. So we have a lot of programming here in Minnesota where there's county funds, but unless it's a waiver specifically, they can have multiple sources of resources and programs that they're working on. But if they have a waiver, because the waivers, at least through the counties here in Minnesota, do have access to services, and EE is intended to support individuals who can't get access to extended supports any other way. So next slide. Because some of the benefits is that it is a voluntary service. I talked a little bit about that. So individuals can refer themselves and they can choose whether or not they're going to participate in this program, like any program. I think the ability to refer themselves, voluntary participate, and then also what's can be a little unique is that they are able to decide if they're going to receive supports at work or outside of work. So a lot of the individuals we're serving are receiving their supports outside of their workplace. Many of them are choosing not to tell their employer that there is a provider involved in supporting them. So I know one of the earlier examples was individuals having issues with traumatic brain injury and just how to apply that at work. And we can coach people outside of work and help them learn how to apply the strategies themselves when they're on site. And then they, obviously look at goals and help set strategies for those individuals to work towards those goals, like many services. Next slide. So the supports are very similar to job coaching, but a lighter touch. A lot of the same services that you're going to see through job coaching, you're going to receive in EE and more. Actually, extended employment, I would argue, a lot of times is supporting people and things outside of work. So while we do the identifying and setting of goals, training and retraining, helping them to adapt or navigate changes in supervisors, all those bumps in the road that oftentimes cause challenges or individuals to lose their jobs, they have a great supervisor that moves on. And during that change is when things really get challenging. But oftentimes extended employment is helping coach through things outside of work. So an exacerbation of medical issues or family, challenges that are causing distraction. So working through those things to make sure that they're not taking those issues to work and are able to work through those. And I think that's one thing that really is a strength of our program, but also makes it unique, because we are able to provide supports in a way that job coaching isn't always able to. So next slide. And again, I touched on referrals, but oftentimes individuals will refer themselves. Largely, our VR program here in Minnesota is referring to the extended employment program because, again, we serve a lot of the same people. But I also, when I was a provider, worked a lot with our local school districts, our local colleges, so students who were working but also trying to navigate school, so supporting them through kind of how to balance that. And I worked actually very closely with our local brain injury association, so supporting families and just individuals as they were kind of working through brain injury and the needs that they had around that. Next slide. Why one of the things that makes it so unique is that it is not a conflict of interest for individuals to be co-enrolled in many of the other programs we have here in Minnesota. So services for EE can begin as soon as they start a job. Oftentimes, we'll have individuals show up at VR because they're struggling in a job, and they really want to start looking for something different. So they will enroll in VR services, and we'll start them also in an extended employment program to support them in the job they have while they try to figure out what a better fit is and move forward in that. And so EE can stay involved during all of those services and then transition to the new job once they start it, even if they're still receiving other supports through VR or other services available in the state. We often get questions about like where openings are and when we can, like where they can enroll. And because it changes daily, we just often talk about how to manage, like making sure that there's enough programming around the state for that. Next slide. In order to participate in EE, so they have to be eligible, the medical diagnosis, they have to be employed and have 3 functional limitations, but they also have to be willing to meet with their provider at least twice a month. So this is where I talked about it being more of a lighter touch than job coaching. Oftentimes job coaching is going to be, multiple times a week, if not daily, especially when they're first starting. But EE will provide more of a light touch where they'll meet with them in person. We do allow for virtual. And then sometimes that will be in person one time where they're checking in with the supervisor, getting performance feedback, and then virtually kind of just to check in, like, have you applied some of the things we've discussed throughout the month? And this is where sometimes there's transition between job coaching and extended employment. So they might use job coaching to get settled into the job in that more intensive way with the kind of one-on-one training, but use EE to do the performance check-ins and then transition to EE as a person becomes more stable and comfortable in their position. They also need to be willing to submit copies of their earnings statements, so they're just pay stubs, because as I said earlier, that's how the providers are paid. They're paid per hour worked by the participant. So we do have to have copies of their work records and make sure that we're paying for the individuals as they're working. Because a provider can bill for an individual if they've met with them twice per month and that individual work. But sometimes individuals might not show up for their meetings. And so then the providers aren't paid. So as long as there's work records to demonstrate that they worked, and the provider is able to demonstrate that they met with them, that's how they are able to bill against the grant as a pay for performance. And then individuals will work with an EE provider to develop that annual support plan. And there's a lot of detail that we really look for in this. We really want them to consider not only what the challenges are in their current job, but really look at that career advancement opportunity. So what are their preferences? Not just, I want to stay in this job for a long time, but are they working in the industry that they really want to be in? Are they working in the positions that they really want to be in? Or are they just kind of going after jobs because they need a job to pay their bills? We want them not to be working just to work to pay the bills, but to really work towards being in a career and advancing in that career, and supporting people to the best of their abilities. So that annual support plan has a lot of expected details to include in it, which are the preferences, the long-term goals, the short-term goals, the strategies around those goals, which is like a lot of job coaching types of support plans too, but goes a little bit deeper in the career advancement piece of it. Next slide. So just some examples of services that we, that of successes that we've had. I pulled all these from when I was a provider. So Wanda was a single mother, and she experienced a brain aneurysm at work, and which was a really traumatic experience for her. And once she was able to go through the recovery of the medical part of the experience, and it was time to return to work, she found when she got to work, she was actually struggling more with her memory than she realized when she was going through physical therapy, and at home before returning to work. So she worked with our VR program to kind of get settled into work in a more intensive supports. We have something called staying on the job at the time. And so staying on the job assisted her with disclosing her disability, really identifying the accommodations she needed to do the job that she'd been doing before that. And through that process, they discovered that she really wasn't able to return to that job. It just was going to be too much of a challenge, and she needed to find a better fit. So she continued to work with that program, found a better fit that was in more of an administrative role, and learned that job. Um, she had a really supportive supervisor at the time, but she had a lot of trouble navigating her coworkers. She felt like they were looking at her differently, and she just felt uncomfortable in the environment. So as we continued to work with her, she kind of, gained her confidence, and she asked to exit from those services, but then called us back and said, okay, no, I'm struggling a little bit as these bumps in the road come up, so I need some additional supports. So we referred her into extended employment. And what was really great about that is extended employment allows for that self-referral. You can access those services much more quickly than you can access VR. It takes months a lot of times to enroll in our VR program. EE, you can get them enrolled within a week. And so she reached out and did a lot of self-advocacy, which was great. And as we supported her in EE and she felt more settled, felt more comfortable with her coworkers, again, she asked to be exited from the program. And about 2 years later, I would get a call from her. And she'd say, okay, I got a new supervisor and I'm really struggling with this individual, so I'd really like to start services again until I can get settled again. And then after about a year, she felt more comfortable. And then a year later called me. She'd been assigned new duties, and so she was feeling really anxious about that. So we worked with her until she felt comfortable there, and she really utilized the program when she needed it. And I think one thing that makes EE unique is it does allow for that coming and going as it's needed. And after about 5 years of using the program as she needed to and didn't need to, she's maintained her success. As last I heard, she was continuing to work in her most recent job and has done really well there. So next slide. Another example of a success story is Eric, who he worked for a major healthcare system. And this was a gentleman that I served for, I think I worked with him for about 10 years, but all told, he worked with extended employment for over 20 years. So he was in our program for 20 years. One thing I kind of rushed across, I think in an earlier slide, is that we do set up these contracts to ensure that the same providers maintain their grants year over year, so that for individuals that are in these programs long-term, like Eric, are stable and consistent with the person they're receiving services from, so that their provider is maintained the stability that they need to have this service. And so unless they're not in compliance or they're not successful in providing the services, they keep their grants each year. And that's a key component to this program success here in Minnesota, I think. Because someone like Eric, he was part of the program for over 20 years and worked in this particular position with a major healthcare system here in the Twin Cities. And he also actually had experienced a traumatic brain injury, and he was referred to me by our Brain Injury Association. And it caused him some very specific work skill limitations. Memory loss was a big one, but also interpersonal skills. His interpersonal skills were difficult in that he didn't always understand social cues, and when he kind of stood around and chatted too much, and his sense of humor was a little inappropriate. And, in passing, it was fine, but for individuals who worked with him more closely and day to day, it became a challenge. And where he was supported most was actually through his supervisor. His supervisor personality-wise, they really kind of rubbed the wrong way. And so she would call me frustrated and on the verge of firing him because of his interpersonal skills. And I would talk her through how to coach him or, kind of ways to help redirect him. And then I would meet with him and really kind of explain what was going on. But at the end of the day, the support was really for the supervisor, but that was what allowed Eric to keep his job. Because there were many times where she threatened to fire him or lay him off. And he would come to VR and apply for placement services. And then after a while, they'd work it out and it'd be fine. But he ended up retiring from that job after 20 years of being on the program and had the same supervisor the entire time. So it was a huge success for the extended employment program for him. Next slide. And then we have Molly, and she was born with cerebral palsy and also experienced some significant life traumas. She went through some very traumatic experiences as a young woman, and then again, kind of as a early to late 20s and into her 30s. And it really created some debilitating anxiety and trust issues. So when she had a provider that she would open up to, if that individual changed, because as caseworkers do, they move on to new jobs, it would cause her to almost start all the way back from the beginning of having to open up and trust even a program, not just the person, but the program as a whole. So when Molly came to me, she just was very anxious, but also had a lot of physical limitations. She had visual limitations, mobility limitations. She had a lot of workplace accommodations in place for her physical limitations, but her supervisor didn't really understand anxiety or support her in that or really accommodate that. So we spent a lot of time working on putting things in place where she felt supported by her workplace from the anxiety standpoint. She had a lot of the physical and needs met, but she didn't feel her needs were being met with the anxiety that she experienced. But she'd been in her job for a long time. But again, was an individual that was kind of always on the verge of feeling like she was going to lose her job. So we spent a lot of time navigating conversations between her and her supervisor's performance feedback, and then just working with her outside of work on how to really take the information we were working with her on and apply it at work when she would return. So again, this is someone who's had a lot of long-term support through EE, but she's still in EE services, and she started her job in 2007, went into EE not long after that, and remains on the program today. So just a really successful support that now I'm told she doesn't really need supports. When she worked with me, she called me almost 10 times a day for a while, and now they just check in twice a month. So that's been a huge support for her. And that is the end of my slides. So if there are any questions, I don't know if I saw any come in through the chat.
So we haven't had any questions pop in, but Megan, do we have a minute or two for anyone to chime in with a question that they
Yeah, absolutely.
themselves off their
We have
mic?
some time flexibility, so if any questions have come up over the course of our presentations today, you can either chat them in or raise your hand and we can take you off mute if you want to explain it over the audio. So
That
just let
sounds
us
really
know.
good. And I just wanted to say, while we are looking for any hands raised, if you have any questions, we're of course happy to take them. And you've also got our contact information. But what I think has been important today is that some states have taken on this challenge in a system way, like the way that Megan has described. It's an important, large, expensive program, but it has return on investment, as Megan described. And then all the way to what Kelly's described, which are some of the very individualized, tailored approaches by getting that benefits planner, hooking them up with an individual who wants to go to work and has some significant barriers. So I'm excited today about how we've been able to, with these guys and their expertise, cover that whole gamut. Questions at all for any of us?
Does look like we have a hand raised from Scott Winzig, so I'm going to allow you to uh, talk, Scott. I think it's going to give you an opportunity to unmute. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm a paralegal at a PNA. I also have a brother with a TBI, but his TBI is not like as severe as others. So it's that thing where he's not like term disabled enough to be on support, but also still has issues with job employment. What would be some other resources to send to him, help him out? He just has sometimes trouble with like brain fog and other things, so it makes kind of traditional workplace a little harder for him. Thank you.
I'll mention one thing, and I really encourage my my partners on this webinar to chime in as well. But I think that there are, I would like to say that there's sometimes a myth that you have to be, for instance, on Social Security Administration benefits to be able to participate in a public vocational rehabilitation program, when in fact, you do not have to be on Social Security. If you are, you're automatically eligible or you're presumed eligible. So there is an emphasis from VR to absolutely serve people who are on Social Security. I don't know if that's the case for your brother or not, but I think that vocational rehabilitation can be a good avenue for what you're describing, where he doesn't need some of the intensive supports like we've talked about today, but it sounds like he could absolutely benefit from some vocational guidance and counseling, maybe some accommodation guidance, and perhaps assistive technology or even job placement supports. What would you all add, Kelly or Megan?
I put in the chat, I put Jan accommodations. They're a free service as well, where, you know, I had several, when I was an employment specialist, I had several individuals with severe traumatic brain injuries. And you are right, they typically could do a lot of things on their own. It would be things like me having to call them in the morning to remind them of their schedule, and really finding that technology to help, you know, get them on that routine and understand what their task duties are. So I think we're so blessed now to have such smart technology out there that I'm sure that, you know, GN accommodations could help you with some of that assistive technology if that's just a simple thing that he needs to be successful.
I was just going to add, you know, we talked a lot, like, especially in my part of the presentation, I talked about 3 functional limitations, which is usually what we consider the most severely disabled, 3 or more. But many VR programs will serve people with 0 functional limitations. So kind of what you're saying about your brother, where he may not have the 3 functional limitations, but he may have 1 or 2. But VR, at least in our state, and I believe in most states, will serve people with 0, 1, 2, and 3. So just because he's not the most severely disabled does not mean he's not eligible for services.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? I think Beth made a good one from Missouri, that the program that Minnesota has highlighted is really a great opportunity to support people long term. And we kind of traded another message that we all know there's a tremendous emphasis on work right now. And so being able to package up some of this kind of information and share it with decision makers in your state to show how, you know, for a very long time, some decades, this program has been in place in Minnesota and continues to pay dividends. All right, well, it looks like I can just turn this all back over to you, Megan, and just really express my thanks to both of you, Kelly and Megan, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And I just wanted to say thank you as well to Megan, Jill, and Kelly for joining us today. I do think, Jill, I'm going to be turning it back over to you in a minute to go through the resources that we have available. But Rebecca, if you can go to the next slide. In case any of your burning questions come up after today's event, Jill, Kelly, and Megan have kindly offered to share their contact information if you'd like to reach out with them with questions. You can also reach out to our DTAC mailbox, which is later in the slides, but and we can route it to them as well. I did just want to comment that Diane chatted in saying she's become a big fan of Habitica. It's an app that gamifies habits and daily tasks and makes getting tasks done fun and something that could be added as a tool. So thanks, Diane, for sharing that. And Jill, I'll turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about the resources that we have to share on our next slide.
Oh, thank you very much. We wanted to close out with some links to a variety of resources that have been made possible because of the DTAC and working closely with NASHA. There are resources that have been specifically written for people living with brain injury, ones that really stress that you can work and improving your employment success, planning to work while receiving benefits. We have some resources that are specific to VR counselors and employment service providers that are listed for considerations to work effectively with people that have brain injury, as well as returning to work after brain injury. We were able to develop a resource for Centers for Independent Living that also brings some awareness to brain injury needs related to employment, and community service providers like an association, brain injury resource facilitator. This is a document that you can use to have conversations with people about their potential interest in work, and through encouraging language that helps link them up with their next steps. And then finally, there was a webinar just last month on ABLE. You heard Kelly talk about that today. If you have an interest in diving deeper, there's a link to that webinar. And if you go on to the next slide, please. We've developed a new resource that is going to be shared with you all after this session, as I understand it, Megan, and it really mirrors a lot of what we talked about today. It's just 2 pages long, but it is the long-term support approaches for people with brain injury, and really, again, in the absence of paid long-term supports. So it gives some questions that any employment service provider could ask to think through a variety of creative options for being able to successfully meet a person's needs. And on the next slide, go ahead.
Jill, I was just going to let you know that the link to that last resource is in the chat as well, and we'll include it in a follow-up email as well so that everyone can access it following the event.
Perfect. So lots of resources in your chat, lots of resources in this slide deck. They're all coming your way. And with that, I'll turn it more formally and officially back over to you, Megan.
Great. Thanks, Jill. And yes, so our DTAC contact information is here on the screen. We have an email account as well as a website with all of those resources that we were just talking about, as well as our past webinars and events. Following this meeting, we will be sharing later this week a follow-up email that includes the links to everything that we've linked in the chat, as well as a link to the recording of this session, and last but not least, a link to the slides from today. And then on our next slide, we really appreciate your participation in today's event and hope that it was helpful to you as you learn more about options for extended supported employment. We'd greatly appreciate if you could provide some feedback in our post-RISE community session survey. And this will pop up at the end of the Zoom as well. And if it doesn't, we'll include it in the follow-up email also, but we really value your feedback and hope that you are satisfied and engaged with today's event and the awesome speakers that we had today. So with that, I think we can close out, and we really appreciate, again, your time this afternoon. Give you 2 short minutes back, and hope to connect with you another time soon on a future event. Thank you.